What if I told you that the future of the monarchy's entire financial empire almost fell into the hands of someone who was never meant to control it? Princess Anne's chilling revelation has shaken Windsor to its core. In a family where loyalty is measured not just in devotion, but in silence, Anne's decision to break centuries of restraint has opened a door that can never be closed again. For behind the glittering crowns, the golden palaces, and the carefully staged photographs lies something far more dangerous: money. And with money comes power. The kind of power that can build legacies or destroy them. For years, Camilla presented herself as a figure of support, standing by Charles as he carried the burden of kingship. But beneath that polished exterior, Anne claims, was a woman weaving her influence into the very arteries of the monarchy's wealth. Whispers first emerged, not in the tabloids, but in the hushed corridors of the palace itself, where aides and staff spoke of sudden changes in accounts, unexplained approvals, and curious signatures on documents that were never meant to cross Camilla's desk. To outsiders, it may have seemed trivial, but Anne, long known as the most vigilant and unyielding of the Queen's children, sensed something more sinister at play. The monarchy's fortune is not mere extravagance. It is centuries of estates, priceless heirlooms, land revenues, charitable trusts, and sovereign reserves, all delicately balanced to ensure survival through crisis. If that fragile system were to be manipulated, even subtly, the consequences could tear the institution apart from within. And Anne, bound by duty and instinct, positioned herself as its reluctant guardian. The story of her revelation begins not with confrontation, but with discovery. Deep within the labyrinth of Windsor's record halls, Anne came across papers that should not have existed. Numbers that did not add up. Accounts that led nowhere. Signatures that carried the faint shadow of manipulation. It was a whisper on paper, but one that roared in her heart. The realization struck like thunder. Camilla, the very woman the monarchy had embraced into its fold, might be orchestrating a financial power grab that could shift centuries of control into her own hands. The more Anne looked, the more the picture grew darker. Funds from trusts that once supported charitable endeavors seemed to have been rerouted. Estates whispered about in meetings were suddenly under review. The monarchy's vast financial lifeline, safeguarded across generations, was being quietly adjusted. To the public, nothing seemed amiss, but Anne, with the piercing clarity inherited from her mother, saw the threads being pulled loose. She knew that once unraveling began, the monarchy's stability would be at the mercy of someone whose ambitions were far greater than anyone had realized. And yet, the most chilling part of Anne's discovery was not in the numbers, but in the silence that surrounded them. Few dared to question. Few even dared to notice. Those who did seemed either complicit or too afraid to act. It was in this moment that Anne recognized her role. She could either turn away and let history record another silent betrayal, or she could rise against the tide and protect the very crown her mother had sworn to defend. What exactly had she uncovered that forced her to risk everything? That is the question which continues to haunt Windsor's walls. The question that transformed a quiet suspicion into a storm. Anne's revelation was not simply an accusation. It was a crack in the very foundation of trust. And as Anne lifted the veil, what she revealed was more than just a power grab. It was a betrayal threatening the monarchy's very foundation. Behind every throne lies a network of whispers, and Camilla's web was far larger than anyone dared to imagine. For years, her presence had been carefully packaged to the public as dutiful, loyal, and supportive. Yet behind the polished facade, Anne began to sense an architecture of influence stretching quietly through the veins of the monarchy. It wasn't just charm or proximity to Charles that gave Camilla sway. It was something far more deliberate than connections that reached beyond the palace gates, into boardrooms, banks, and corridors, where power was measured not by crowns, but by control of wealth. Anne's suspicions grew as she pieced together small fragments. The sudden appearance of new advisors who seemed unusually loyal to Camilla. The way voices once neutral on palace finances now leaned in her favor, and the strange speed with which her suggestions made in moments when Charles was most vulnerable were adopted as policy. It was as though Camilla had been weaving a net, slowly and carefully, so that one day the monarchy's most important financial levers would rest in her grip. Advisors tied to investment firms and banking institutions began circling around her. Some were presented as consultants for charitable projects, others as informal advisors on royal estates, but their loyalty seemed to orbit only one figure: Camilla. Anne, ever watchful, noticed that it was during Charles's most difficult moments, when illness or exhaustion weighed heavily, that Camilla's influence sharpened. She knew exactly when to press, when to convince him that her ally's advice was for the good of the monarchy, when in truth it served to expand her network's reach. For Anne, this was more than manipulation of a brother's trust. It was the calculated capture of a kingdom's resources. She began to suspect that hidden channels existed, channels that bypassed traditional oversight, untraceable corridors where money and influence moved unseen. The more she uncovered, the more she realized this wasn't a series of coincidences, but a deliberate plan. Perhaps the most alarming discoveries came when she heard of Camilla's discreet gatherings, disguised as charity meetings. On the surface, these were noble events, discussions of philanthropic projects, meetings with donors, evenings where the language of service masked every conversation. But underneath, Anne sensed something darker. These were not casual encounters. They were the perfect cover for negotiations about influence, for stitching together allegiances that could one day tilt the balance of royal finances in Camilla's favor. To the public, these dinners seemed harmless. To Anne, they were strategy sessions in disguise. The palace itself began to feel like a battlefield of quiet loyalties. Staff whispered in hushed tones, unsure which orders were genuine and which carried Camilla's hidden imprint. Aides who once answered directly to the crown appeared hesitant, as though weighed down by invisible strings. Money and loyalty, Anne realized, had begun to entwine in a dangerous knot, and at the center of that knot was Camilla's hand. This was no longer about a consort's influence over her husband. It was about a woman positioning herself as the silent architect of a monarchy's fortune. But the truth became undeniable when Anne stumbled upon records no one was meant to see. Locked away in Windsor's archives were papers that told a story darker than any rumor. They were not the grand proclamations of monarchs past, or the ceremonial decrees preserved for history's gaze. These were ledgers, financial records, the dry ink of administration that few would ever bother to read. Yet, within those pages lay the threads of a scheme so carefully woven that it might have gone unnoticed forever, had Anne not stumbled upon them. She had gone into that chamber expecting routine, but what she found was a secret that threatened to rewrite the monarchy's future. The first pages looked harmless, a collection of figures and balances that reflected the vast wealth of the crown estate. But then, line after line, the numbers began to drift into shadows. Funds earmarked for long-standing trusts appeared to vanish, only to resurface in destinations no one could trace. Estates that had always yielded predictable revenues suddenly showed reduced returns, while charitable allocations shrank without explanation. To most, the figures might have seemed like bureaucratic anomalies, but Anne's eye was sharper than that. She had been raised to respect duty, detail, and tradition. And what she saw was not an error, it was an intention. As she turned the pages, her heart tightened. There were signatures in the margins, not Camilla's hand directly, but initials, codes, and authorizations that pointed toward her inner circle. People close enough to her to act on her behalf, close enough to move money under the guise of legitimate oversight. The deeper Anne went, the more chilling the truth became. These were not mistakes. They were diversion streams of wealth redirected toward unknown channels. And in the faint ink of those documents lay the unmistakable shadow of Camilla's approval. But perhaps the most shocking revelations were not the missing sums, but the whispers written between the lines. Inheritance funds meant to honor the legacy of previous monarchs had been adjusted, their destinations changed. Charitable trusts, long dedicated to causes the late queen herself had cherished, showed alterations so sudden it was impossible to miss the hand of manipulation. To Anne, it was nothing less than betrayal. The monarchy's fortune was not just money, it was memory, duty, and a bond with the people. And here it was, being bent, reshaped in silence, for purposes that had nothing to do with tradition and everything to do with ambition. Anne froze in that chamber, her mind torn. What would it mean if she brought this to light? Charles, already worn by the burdens of the crown, would be crushed by the idea that the woman he leaned upon was orchestrating something in the shadows. Yet, to say nothing would mean complicity. Was she protecting her brother by remaining silent, or abandoning him by refusing to act? The weight of loyalty pressed against the urgency of truth, and for a moment, Anne stood suspended between love and duty. Then came the final blow. Among the documents were references, subtle but unmistakable, to external negotiations, contacts with international financiers, who had no rightful place in the monarchy's financial web. Hidden deals that suggested Camilla's network reached far beyond Britain's borders, into the hands of those who saw the crown not as heritage, but as opportunity. It was the kind of revelation that left no room for hesitation. Anne knew silence was no longer an option. Her next move would risk everything. When Anne finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 1,000 years of royal duty, and it shattered the silence inside Buckingham Palace. She had remained patient, measured, and restrained for as long as she could. But the moment arrived when truth could no longer be hidden behind velvet curtains. The documents she uncovered burned in her conscience like fire. And so, Anne summoned her family to a private meeting, a gathering heavy with tension, the kind that shakes dynasties to their core. There was no agenda, no polite introductions. Only Anne's solemn face, the papers clutched in her hand, and the storm she was about to unleash. With unshakable resolve, she turned to Camilla. Her words were sharp, precise, and unflinching. She laid down the ledgers and signatures before her, exposing the quiet diversions, the redirections of wealth, the marks of approval that pointed back to Camilla's shadowy hand. For years, whispers had danced in the dark corners of Windsor, but in this moment, they took flesh. This was no longer a rumor, it was an accusation, deliberate and undeniable. Camilla's mask of composure faltered, as Anne's voice rose with the authority of history itself, declaring that the monarchy's fortune was being bent for ambition, not service. The room shifted. Charles sat in silence, his hands trembling between wife and sister, heart and heritage. To defend Camilla was to risk enabling betrayal. To stand with Anne was to wound the woman he loved. He stared at the documents with a hollow expression, torn apart by the cruel choice set before him. The air grew colder as Camilla denied and deflected, but her denials clashed against the ink on paper. The longer the silence stretched, the more suffocating the truth became. Then, quietly but unmistakably, William and Catherine rose to Anne's side. They did not shout, nor did they accuse. Instead, their presence alone spoke volumes. Catherine's eyes carried the weight of Diana's memory, while William's posture revealed the burden of a future king unwilling to allow corruption to poison his reign. Their quiet alignment with Anne drew a line in the sand. For the first time, Camilla's isolation was visible, and the fracture within the family stood in stark relief. The confrontation did not end with resolution. It ended with dread. For as Anne's accusations echoed through the chamber, no one could deny the power of her evidence. And yet, no decision was reached. Charles retreated into silence. Camilla simmered with fury. William and Catherine stood resolute, and Anne carried the burden of a family now cracked open. The question hung over them all, unspoken yet unavoidable. Had Anne just set off a royal war that could never be undone? And yet, what followed next would prove that Camilla's ambitions were far greater than anyone feared. The deeper Anne dug, the darker the plot became, and suddenly, the monarchy's fortune looked more like a trap. What began as suspicious ledgers now stretched across borders into offshore trusts and shadowy accounts that traced back to names suspiciously close to Camilla's inner circle. These were not the accounts of tradition-bound estates or established charities. They were hidden reservoirs, designed to hold vast sums beyond the reach of oversight. To Anne, the truth struck like lightning. This was the scaffolding of a parallel empire, a financial kingdom built in silence and prepared to rival the crown itself. And as she pieced together the fragments, the horror grew. Funds that should have remained anchored to Britain's heritage were being siphoned into strange ventures abroad, their purpose cloaked, but their intent unmistakable. Whispered deals about royal properties began to surface, agreements that hinted at estates being leveraged for influence far beyond their symbolic worth. It was no longer about wealth, it was about control. Anne's fear sharpened with every page she studied, a dread that the monarchy, once an institution of sovereignty, might soon become nothing more than a puppet show, its strings pulled by Camilla's hidden network. Inside Windsor, the air grew thick with suspicion. Staff members shifted uneasily, unsure whether their loyalty belonged to the crown or to the queen consort, who seemed to command invisible power. Whispers circulated in corners, glances carried weight, and the sense of betrayal hung heavier than the chandeliers above. Anne realized that if this knowledge ever reached the outside world, the scandal would erupt with such force that it could scorch the monarchy beyond repair. The truth she held was no longer a private burden. It was a ticking storm. But Anne's revelations couldn't stay hidden. The walls of Windsor were already trembling. When whispers left the palace and reached the streets, The nation reacted with fury, and Camilla's carefully built image began to collapse. What had once been whispered suspicions in the gilded corridors of Windsor now spilled across headlines, fueling stories that painted a devastating picture of betrayal and greed. Newspapers seized the scent of scandal, publishing reports of financial irregularities tied to the consort, hinting at a plot to seize control of the monarchy's wealth. The public, long sensitive to the fragile trust between crown and people, erupted in anger. What began as murmurs became rallies, protests, and demands for answers. For the first time since Diana's untimely death, the monarchy faced an uproar that threatened to destabilize its very core. Crowds gathered outside royal residences holding placards, their chants echoing across the country. The press crafted a cruel but powerful refrain: not Diana's legacy, but Camilla's ambition. That single line became the rallying cry of a nation that felt betrayed. To millions, Diana represented purity, grace, and sacrifice, and Camilla's name became the bitter opposite, an emblem of manipulation and selfish intent. The more the press dug, the darker the narrative became, portraying Camilla not as a queen consort standing beside her husband, but as a woman scheming for financial supremacy within the monarchy's hidden vaults. And as Camilla's reputation spiraled downward, William and Catherine were thrust into the unforgiving light of public expectation. They became the faces of integrity, symbols of the monarchy's possible redemption. Crowds praised their dignity, their refusal to be tainted by scandal, and their quiet alignment with Anne, who was now celebrated as the heroic whistleblower. Anne, once the most private of royals, was hailed as the savior who had dared to expose what others tried to bury. The contrast could not have been sharper, Anne standing as the unbreakable guardian of duty, while Camilla was cast as the betrayer, who placed ambition above crown and country. The monarchy itself staggered beneath the weight of this crisis. Analysts on television spoke of its worst credibility disaster since Diana's tragedy, warning that trust, once lost, might never be regained. Every word Camilla spoke was scrutinized, every appearance mocked, every silence interpreted as guilt. The very woman who had once fought for public acceptance now found herself drowning under waves of condemnation. The institution trembled as it faced the terrifying possibility that its survival was once again tied not to tradition, but to the hearts of a nation ready to turn its back. Cornered by both family and nation, Camilla was left with only one desperate option. Camilla refused to be defeated quietly. Her counterstrike was as ruthless as her plan. If Anne had exposed her web of influence, then Camilla would fight back with everything she had. Almost overnight, stories began appearing in newspapers, and whispered briefings to the press painted a darker picture not of Camilla, but of Anne. These leaks were crafted with precision, portraying Anne as jealous, bitter, and power-hungry. A sister who could not bear to see another woman claim the spotlight within the monarchy. To the casual observer, it appeared as if Anne's revelations were nothing more than a calculated attempt to destroy Camilla out of envy. The timing was no accident. Camilla's allies understood the power of public perception, and within days, Anne's honor was being questioned. Was she acting out of duty or spite? Did she truly care about the monarchy, or was she grasping at influence she had never been given? For a moment, the narrative began to shift, and Camilla seized on that sliver of doubt. She used it to force Charles into the most agonizing position of his reign. Advisors, many of them already tangled in her network, urged the king to defend his wife publicly. They argued that to remain silent would be an admission of guilt, that the monarchy's survival depended on shielding Camilla from further attack. For Charles, the pressure was unbearable. His love for Camilla clashed violently with the evidence Anne had laid before him. To stand with Anne meant betraying his marriage. To defend Camilla meant betraying the trust of his sister and risking the very integrity of the crown. The weight of that choice broke him down, leaving him hollow-eyed and restless, a monarch torn between heart and duty. And as he faltered, Camilla pressed forward, determined to fortify her position. Behind closed doors, she allegedly attempted to force new clauses into royal decrees, amendments that would secure her financial oversight under the guise of administrative modernization. It was a daring move, a final push to cement her control regardless of the scandal raging around her. For Camilla, this was her gamble. If she could bend the monarchy's laws to her will, then no accusation, no public fury, not even Anne's defiance could undo her power. But ambition has its limits, and in her boldest move, Camilla miscalculated. Her attempt to rewrite the rules not only deepened suspicion, but also revealed the very desperation Anne had warned of. What was meant to strengthen her grip instead signaled her downfall. For the harder Camilla fought, the more it became clear to all that she was not defending tradition but clinging to control. Because, in the shadows, Anne was preparing her most devastating revelation yet. The monarchy's fate came down to one explosive meeting, and Anne was ready to risk it all. For weeks, the family had simmered in suspicion, whispers filling the halls. But now, there would be no more rumors, no more secrets left to fester. In the grand chamber, where decisions of state had once been made, Anne gathered her siblings, trusted advisors, and the heirs who would one day inherit the throne. In her hands, she carried the final weapon evidence so undeniable, so damning, that even the strongest denial could not erase it. Every eye in the room fixed on her as she laid the documents before them, her voice unwavering, her conviction cutting through the tension like a blade. Page after page revealed the shocking truth: Camilla's hidden hand in redirecting millions, money siphoned away from trusts, charities, and estates, all funneled through channels that bore her shadow. Anne's words did not need embellishment. The proof spoke for itself. What had once been dismissed as rumor was now exposed as reality, and with every revelation, the silence in the room grew heavier. For Charles, it was devastation beyond words. The papers did not just implicate his wife, they confirmed what Anne had feared all along. Betrayal was no longer suspected, it was a fact. The king's heartbreak was visible, etched in the stillness of his face, in the quiet collapse of a man torn between the crown he swore to protect and the woman he had fought so hard to defend. Tears welled as the weight of truth sank into him. He had believed he was shielding Camilla from cruelty, from a nation unwilling to forgive. Instead, he now realized he had been shielding her from accountability. The crown itself had been at risk, and he had not seen it. Then came the moment that pierced through the silence. William stepped forward, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. He thanked Anne, not as a son or a nephew, but as the future king. He declared that her courage had saved the monarchy from ruin, that her willingness to speak when all others stayed silent had preserved the crown's honor for generations yet to come. In that moment, Anne was no longer just the dutiful sister. She became the guardian of the monarchy itself. Camilla, cornered and exposed, erupted. Rage poured from her in desperate denials, tears mixing with fury as she tried to twist the narrative one last time. She cried betrayal, claimed conspiracy, but the evidence before her drowned out her protests. The family did not move to her defense this time. Her allies shrank into silence, her power dissipating with every desperate word. The woman who had once commanded influence now stood alone, her carefully built image crumbling before the very institution she sought to control. When the chamber finally settled, one truth was clear. The monarchy had chosen its side. They rallied around Anne's courage, recognizing that she had saved not just wealth, but legacy. Camilla's collapse was complete, but her shadow lingered still, for even in her defeat, the damage she had done would echo. But while Camilla's downfall seemed final, the echoes of her plot still linger in the shadows of Windsor. In the end, Anne's stand wasn't just about money, it was about the survival of the monarchy itself. What began as suspicion became a battle of truth, and her courage transformed her into the crown's quiet savior. The public, once divided, now hailed her as the unsung protector of the institution, the daughter who carried her mother's steel and refused to let betrayal destroy what had been built over centuries. Her defiance lit a fire within William and Catherine, who immediately began drafting reforms to secure transparency, determined to ensure that never again could hidden hands twist the monarchy's wealth for personal gain. For Charles, the cost was agony betrayal by the woman he loved, yet also a newfound respect for the sister who had done what he could not. Camilla's influence shattered, her image scarred beyond repair, leaving her forever diminished in the eyes of the nation. And through it all, one truth became clear. Anne had upheld the legacy of the late queen, proving that duty must always outweigh ambition. Yet, even in victory, shadows lingered, for the fight for the crown is never truly finished, and the next storm already waits on the horizon. And so, as Windsor's halls grow quieter, one truth remains. The crown may glitter, but only courage can protect it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.